Clearwater County, Minnesota, in the autumn of 1889, was not a place that forgave carelessness. The land rolled out in long prairie swells, broken only by stands of birch and bur oak, and by October the cold came down from the north like something with intention, not gradually, not with warning, but with the sudden decisive force of a door being shut on everything warm. The ground hardened in a single night. The sky went the color of old pewter, and held that color for days at a stretch. Ponds filmed over at their edges, then frosted solid, then disappeared entirely under the first blowing snow. And the settlers of that county, most of them Scandinavian immigrants who had crossed an ocean to find land they could call their own, began the familiar seasonal arithmetic of firewood and livestock and insulated root cellars, calculating what they had against what the coming months would take from them. It was an arithmetic that left little margin for error and none at all for sentiment. You cut wood, you stacked it high and covered it, and stacked more beside what you thought was enough. You sealed gaps, you worried about your animals, you put your children to bed in the back room under every blanket the household possessed, and you prayed the fire held until morning. This was winter. This was what you did. In Clearwater County in 1889, almost no one had found a reason to question any of it. It was in this season, in the last weeks before the first real snow, that the neighbors of Britta Solberg began to notice something happening at her farm on the eastern ridge above Otter Creek. Britta was 31 years old, a widow of 2 years, raising 3 children, Astrid, who was 8, Leif, who was 6, and the youngest, Marta, who had just turned 4, on a farmstead of 80 acres that her late husband Einar had cleared and broken in the 6 years before his death from a fever in the autumn of 1887. The farm was modest, but not failing. There was a sodded barn large enough for 12 animals, a root cellar dug into the north-facing slope, a woodshed that Einar had built wide and deep, and a low timber-framed house that he had raised himself in the spring of 1883, tight and well-chinked but small, the rooms narrow, the ceilings low, built for fuel efficiency rather than comfort. By the standards of the county, Britta Solberg was managing. By the standards that mattered most to her, her children waking warm in February, her children having enough through April, she was not yet certain she was doing what needed to be done. What her neighbors saw in those October weeks was this: Britta was not cutting wood. While every other farm in the valley rang with the sound of axe and maul and splitting wedge from first light until the dark came down, while woodpiles rose against every south-facing wall for a quarter mile in every direction, Britta's yard was mostly quiet. She was doing something to her barn instead. She was hauling timber to it, but not stacking it outside for fuel. She was working inside the structure for days at a stretch, framing something, laying planking, moving materials up into the hayloft by a rope and pulley she had rigged to the peak of the roof. The sounds that came from her barn were not the sounds of splitting and stacking. They were the careful sounds of construction, the measured thud of a mallet, the drag of a saw through fresh timber, the deliberate footsteps of someone working with precision rather than speed. Her oldest daughter, Astrid, spent the afternoons carrying boards from the woodpile to the barn door. The younger two played in the yard and got underfoot, and the work continued regardless. The neighbors who passed on the ridge road slowed their wagons and watched and could not make sense of what they were seeing. The barn was already a barn. It was standing, it was solid. It had held 12 animals through 2 Minnesota winters. And yet, Britta Solberg was rebuilding something inside it, and her woodpile sat nearly untouched, and the cold was coming regardless. By the second week of October, the watching had given way to commentary, and the commentary had found its natural gravity in the opinion of the man most qualified to offer it. Corvin Dahl was 47 years old, Danish-born, and had come to Clearwater County in 1871, nearly 2 decades before most of his neighbors, which granted him a kind of territorial authority that neither money nor temperament alone could have purchased. He ran the largest landholding in that part of the county, nearly 400 acres of mixed pasture and timber, and he kept 60 head of cattle through every winter with a consistency that the smaller farmers respected and quietly studied. He had survived 11 Minnesota winters and had arrived at a set of firm conclusions about what cold required of a person. He was not a cruel man, and he was not a stupid one, but he had learned what worked through hard experience, and learning something thoroughly through hard experience can make a person genuinely slow to believe that anything fundamentally different could work better. This is not a character flaw. It is what experience does to a person. It is what experience did to Corvin Dahl. He came to Britta's farm on a Tuesday in the second week of October, riding the ridge road on a gray mare, and he stopped at the fence line and watched her work for a time before he spoke. She was on the barn roof, running a second layer of sod over the existing covering, tamping it down with a flat-ended post, working in the methodical way of someone following a plan rather than improvising. Astrid was on the ladder below her, passing materials up rung by rung. Corvin watched this for perhaps 5 minutes. The sky was the color of iron. The temperature was falling. The mare shifted under him and he steadied her, and then he called across the yard. He told her that winter would be early this year. He could feel it in the way the geese had moved through in September, lower and faster than usual, not stopping on the lakes the way they did in a mild year. He said a widow with 3 small children could not afford to spend her preparation time on a barn that was already standing and had already proven itself. He said she needed wood, that she needed it split and stacked and covered, and she needed more of it than she thought she did, because every family in that county always thought they had enough, and almost no family ever did. He asked her plainly what she was building up there. Britta looked at him from the roof. She was quiet for a moment in the particular way she had of being quiet before she answered, as if she were testing the answer against something interior before she let it out. She said, "The barn keeps them warm, Eeps." Corvin Dahl looked at the children playing in the frost-hardened yard below and then back at her on the roof, and he shook his head in the slow way of someone who has heard an answer that explains nothing and has confirmed every concern. He said that the barn was for the animals and the house was for the children, and these were not arbitrary distinctions, but the result of long collective experience in cold climates, and that if she did not get serious about her woodpile before the snow came, he would be making the ride out to her farm in January with provisions, and she would be too proud to accept them, and her children would be the ones who suffered for it. He meant every word of it kindly. He believed every word of it completely. He turned his mare and rode back up the ridge road without waiting for a response, and Britta watched him go from the roof for a moment and then went back to tamping sod. The story spread through the valley by the end of that week. The widow Solberg was building something in her barn instead of cutting wood. She had barely any split timber. She had children under 5. She had listened to Corvin Dahl's concern and gone back to work on her roof. The telling of this arrived at people's kitchens wrapped in something between worry and the particular satisfaction that communities find when a person who does things differently appears from the road to be confirming that differently is a mistake. Nobody wished her harm, but nobody either had any way of imagining she was right. What none of them understood, what none of them had any particular reason to understand, was what Britta Solberg knew about heat. And what she knew, she had not learned in Clearwater County. She had learned it in the valley of Gudbrandsdalen in Norway, where she had been born in 1858 and had grown up in her maternal grandmother's farmstead, a property that had been in the family since before anyone alive could trace its origin. Her grandmother, Marta Hagen, the name Britta had given her youngest child deliberately for this reason, had been born on that same farm in 1801, and she had inherited from her own mother a way of thinking about warmth and structure and animals that was older than any written record of it that survived. Marta Hagen was not a sentimental woman, and she was not a superstitious one. She was precise and practical, and she talked about the farm the way an engineer talks about a system. Everything connected, everything purposeful, nothing wasted. She explained the principles of the farmstead to Britta the way you explain arithmetic to a child who is ready to understand it, matter-of-factly, starting from the simplest observable truth and building from there. The Norwegian farm tradition that Marta Hagen had grown up in and transmitted to her granddaughter was called the bostad, and it was not a theory. It was a centuries-old solution to a centuries-old problem, tested through generation after generation of Scandinavian winters that made Minnesota look manageable in comparison. The central principle was one that Norwegians in the deepest valleys had understood and acted upon since the medieval period, that large animals kept in sufficient numbers in a well-insulated enclosure, produce more useful heat than any reasonable quantity of firewood, and that this heat, properly directed and held, can warm living spaces that share a structural deck with the animal quarters below. The old farmsteads in the coldest valleys were not built as separate structures with separate thermal logics. They were built as integrated systems, barn and living quarters in close thermal connection, the heat rising from below, the insulation above holding it in, the family sleeping in warmth that cost them nothing but feed and water and the company of their animals through the long dark. Britta had spent the first 7 years of her life in a house where this was simply true, where the floor of the sleeping loft was warm to bare feet on February mornings because the cattle below had been producing heat through the night, where her grandmother moved through the morning chores with the calm of a person who had built her safety into the structure of the building itself and did not need to worry about it further. When Britta emigrated to America in 1879, 21 years old and newly married to Einar Solberg, she carried this knowledge the way you carry things that were never formally taught, not as a doctrine, not as a method with a name, but as a simple understanding of how the physical world worked. Heat rises, animals are warm. Build the floor between them and the children properly, and the cold becomes a problem for the outside, not the inside. Einar had understood it and believed in it. They had talked about building the farmstead on this principle from the first season, but the first years on new land are consuming in ways that leave no margin for anything beyond the immediate. Land clearing, crop establishing, the endless demands of a working farm in its earliest phase. All of it pressed the future building back, season after season, until it became something they would get to eventually. Einar died before eventually arrived. And so, Britta had inherited a farm built in the conventional American way, house and barn as separate structures, connected by nothing but a path through the yard. 2 winters of conventional fuel management, cutting, splitting, stacking, burning, running short in March regardless, had made her certain she could not sustain this indefinitely. Not alone. Not with 3 children, not on this land, with its exposed eastern ridge and its particular intimacy with the north wind. She'd been planning the modification since the spring, walking the barn in the long August evenings after the children were asleep, working out dimensions, calculating timber needs. By October, she was not improvising, she was executing. The modification she made to the barn was precise in a way that only inherited knowledge can be precise. Not approximate, not experimental. Precise. She began with the hayloft floor, which ran the full length of the barn at a height of 9 feet above the animal stalls below. This floor was already substantial, 2-inch planking on heavy joists, but it was not sealed, and sealed was what the principle required. Gaps between planks allow heat to dissipate rather than accumulate. She laid a second layer of planking across the existing floor, running perpendicular to the first so that the seams did not align, and between the 2 layers she pressed cured moss gathered from the creek banks through September, a material her grandmother had specified because it compressed evenly, held its thickness through the winter, and sealed small gaps without cracking in cold, the way dried clay eventually did. The result was an insulated deck, solid underfoot, tight to air movement, warm on its lower face from the animals below, and slow to surrender that warmth through its upper face. From this deck, she built upward. In the eastern third of the loft, the portion furthest from the barn doors and closest to the farmhouse, sheltered by the building mass on 2 sides, she framed a room. 14 feet east to west, 11 feet north to south, with a ceiling height of 7 feet, using the barn's existing roof structure as the outer wall on 2 sides. The interior walls she framed with 2x4 studs and packed them before boarding the inside face with compressed straw 18 inches deep. 18 inches of dense straw is not a gesture at insulation. It is a serious thermal barrier, equivalent in its resistance to cold to a well-built stone wall half again as thick. She put a heavy plank door in the south wall, positioned so that it opened toward the house for easy night access. She built 2 low sleeping bunks along the east wall. She cut a single small window in the north wall, not for warmth, but so the children would not feel enclosed, so they could look out at the night snow and know where they were. The floor of this room was the insulated deck itself, The floor of the sleeping room was the ceiling of the animals. That was the whole of the design. That was the thing her neighbors could not see from the road and Corvin Dahl could not understand from the fence line, because from any external vantage it looked like a woman rebuilding a barn she did not need to rebuild instead of cutting firewood she desperately needed to cut. The logic was invisible until you stood inside it. The principle was simple enough that a child could understand it, and Britta's children did, because she had explained it to them plainly. The cows are warm. Heat goes up. We sleep where the heat goes. The rest was carpentry. The final element was the roof. She layered an additional 18 inches of sod over the existing barn roof covering, hauling the material up in a woven basket. She and Astrid worked together, one load at a time. What it was, in fact, was the lid of the system. An uninsulated roof loses accumulated heat faster than the animals below can replace it. A well-sodded roof holds heat with a stubbornness that no manufactured material of the period could match. The barn, once the roof was finished, was a closed thermal circuit. The animals produced heat. The insulated deck guided it upward. The sleeping room sat at the natural destination of the rising warmth. The sodded roof held it in. Nothing about this was complicated. Everything about it was right. She estimated, based on her grandmother's descriptions and her own summer calculations, that the sleeping room would maintain a temperature somewhere between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit on a night when the outside air was at 20 below. Not comfortable by any domestic standard, but warm enough that children sleep soundly, that bare skin does not ache, that the cold is a condition of the landscape outside rather than a presence in the room. Adequacy that required no fire, no overnight tending, no morning rebuilding of a fire in a room that had dropped to 20 while the children slept. Adequacy guaranteed by the animals themselves, who would keep producing heat whether or not anyone was awake to manage it, because that is what living bodies do. The first snow of the season came on the 15th of November, 1889, and it fell for 36 hours without meaningful pause. When the sky cleared, the drifts against the north-facing walls of every structure in the valley had reached the eaves. The cold that followed was the kind that makes a county hold its breath. The thermometer on Corvin Dahl's barn wall read 14 below zero on the morning of the 18th, and it did not recover for 11 days. Livestock water froze in buckets within the hour. The trees on the north ridge cracked in the night like rifle shots. Children who crossed the yard between house and outbuilding came back with white patches on their cheeks that their mothers rubbed with snow before bringing them inside. Everyone who had prepared settled into the long labor of burning through what they had saved. Everyone who had not prepared settled into the anxiety of watching it go faster than they'd planned. At Britta Solberg's farm, something different was happening. The children were sleeping in the barn loft and had been since the 1st of November. She had moved them in 2 weeks before the snow came, partly to let them adjust and partly to find any problems before the cold made them harder to address. The first night, Astrid had been cautious and Leif had been openly delighted, and Marta had fallen asleep before Britta finished tucking her in. By the end of the first week, all three were climbing the barn ladder in the evenings without being called. The room was warm, not the surface warmth of a fire nearby, but a deep, even persistent warmth that did not vary with the hour or fluctuate with the draft. Marta would press her palms flat on the planking the way small children press palms to things they find remarkable. The smell was hay and animals and something older, something that Britta recognized from her grandmother's farmstead and had not smelled since she left Norway, the particular warmth of a well-kept barn in deep winter, which is the smell of life being lived steadily against the cold and winning. Britta herself continued sleeping in the house, banking the fire carefully each night. She burned less than half the firewood she had burned the previous winter. The woodpile that had worried Corvin Dahl in October stood taller at the end of December than it had at the end of October, because she was not drawing on it for the overnight hours, the hours when a fire must be fed continuously to keep a room above freezing. Her children did not need a fire. Her children had 12 animals keeping faith with them from below, hour after hour, through every night in November and December, and into the deep cold of January. And the floor above those animals was warm, and the children slept with one blanket each and did not use them fully. The morning that Corvin Dahl came to check on her was the 23rd of January, 1890. The temperature at dawn was 22 degrees below zero, the kind of cold that makes sounds travel strangely, that makes chimney smoke rise in columns that look almost solid, that makes crossing a yard from house to barn feel like a negotiation. He came because he had been carrying a low, persistent unease since October, a sense that he had discharged his neighborly obligation at the fence line and had perhaps not discharged enough of it. He brought flour and salt pork in his saddlebags and had decided before he left his own barn that if she refused the provisions, he would leave them at the door regardless. He tied the mare at the fence post and walked across the yard and noticed before he reached the house door that the woodpile at the south wall was not what it should be, not on the 23rd of January at 22 below. His unease sharpened. He knocked. Britta answered after a moment, dressed for barn work, not pale, not hollow-eyed, not the face of a woman managing a crisis. She looked at him with an expression he could not immediately classify, not alarmed, not embarrassed, something quieter than either. He asked if the children were all right. She said they were in the barn. He heard something in how she said it, not the way you say something has gone wrong, but the way you say something that is simply and factually true and requires no further explanation. He walked with her across the yard, his breath coming in dense clouds, the cold working at his ears and the back of his neck, and she pulled the barn door open and he stepped inside. What met him was warmth. Not the suggestion of warmth, not the marginal warmth of a wind-blocked interior. Dense, living warmth, the warmth of breath and digestion and the steady metabolic heat of 12 large animals who had been producing it without pause through the night and the night before and every night since November. It pressed against his face and hands the way a kitchen feels when you have come in from a hard frost and someone has been baking all morning. He stood just inside the door for a moment and said nothing. Then he followed Britta to the east wall and looked up at the ladder in the door of the sleeping room above, which was standing open. He climbed. He was not a young man, and the ladder was steep, and he climbed it without hurrying and put his head through the doorway of the room above the animals and stopped. Astrid and Leif were playing a game of counting stones on the lower bunk. Marta was asleep in the corner, one arm outstretched, the single wool blanket she slept under having slipped to her waist without waking her. The room was warm, not merely not cold, but warm with the particular even warmth of a place that has been warm continuously rather than a place that has been recently heated. Leif said, without particular drama, that it was warmer than the house, which was why they slept here. He said this in the way that children state things they consider obvious. Corvindal stepped fully into the room. He looked at the ceiling, he looked at the walls, he looked at Marta asleep with the blanket at her waist and her bare arm on the planking. Then he crouched down, without thinking about it, and pressed his palm flat against the floor. He held it there for several seconds. The floor was warm. On the 23rd of January, at 22 degrees below zero, the floor of a room above a working barn on the eastern ridge of Clearwater County, Minnesota, was warm to the palm of a man's bare hand. He stayed crouched for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he stood and looked at the sleeping child and the two children playing and said nothing for a time. He came down the ladder and found Britta in the stalls below. He stood at the bottom of the ladder and looked at the barn ceiling, and then at the cattle, and then at her, quiet in the way of someone who is revising something significant and is doing it carefully and honestly, rather than quickly and defensively. He said, quietly, "Your grandmother showed you this." It was not a question. You do not look at a room built with that kind of precision and assume it was invented. The proportion of the insulation, the placement of the room, the sealed deck, the sodded roof, these were not the decisions of someone experimenting. These were the decisions of someone working from a plan older than themselves. Britta said yes. In Norway. It was the way the farmsteads in the old valleys were built. Corvindal nodded once, slowly. He set the flour and the salt pork on the top rail of the nearest stall partition and told her to take them anyway because the winter was not over and extra was always worth having. She said she would take them and thanked him. He nodded again and walked out into the 22 below and untied his mare and rode back up the ridge road. And for 3 days he said nothing to anyone about what he had found. When he did speak, he spoke at the trading post at Rustad in the first week of February. And what he said, without preamble or softening, was that Britta Solberg had built something in her barn that every family in the county should understand before the following autumn. He said he had stood in a room above her animal stalls on the coldest morning of the year and pressed his hand to the floor, and it had been warm. He said her children were sleeping under one blanket each. He said her woodpile, which he had judged dangerously insufficient in October, was in better condition on the 23rd of January than most of the woodpiles in the valley. He offered no apology for having been wrong, but the weight of what he described carried the apology in it, and everyone in that trading post understood what it cost a man like Corvin Dahl to make it. Within 2 days, a group of 5 men had ridden out to Britta's farm, and she walked them through every element of the construction: the deck, the wall insulation, the roof sodding, the dimensions of the room, the placement relative to the stalls below. She answered every question directly, in the manner of someone who had been waiting for the questions to become possible, and now found them welcome. She explained it as a logic, the way her grandmother had explained it to her, a sequence of observable facts that, once understood, required no special skill to apply. Heat rises, animals produce it continuously. Build a floor between them and the people who need to be warm, insulate it properly, seal the roof above, and the animals do the rest. The principal was older than anyone in that room had any need to name. By the following autumn, 4 farms in the Otter Creek Valley had built versions of what Britta had built. All of them reported the same result: sleeping quarters that held warmth through the night without fuel, without tending, without anyone waking at 2 in the morning to rebuild a fire. February became something closer to manageable. Corvin Dahl built his own version in the spring of 1890, more animals, a larger room, 2 full feet of sod on the roof. He told his wife once that he should have listened more carefully at the fence line in October. She agreed with him, and neither of them said anything further about it, because nothing further needed saying. Britta Solberg's barn stood on the eastern ridge above Otter Creek for more than 40 years after that winter. The sleeping room fell out of active use in the early years of the new century, when the children were grown, and the farm had changed hands, and the new family had no particular reason to understand what the room above the animal stalls had once meant. But the principle did not disappear with the room. It traveled the way practical knowledge travels in communities built on shared vulnerability, not through documents or declarations, but through the hands and conversations of people who had used it and found it true. Several farms in that valley were still incorporating versions of Britta's deck construction into new barn buildings well into the 1900s, built by people who could not have told you where the idea originated, but who knew from experience that it worked. The remarkable had become ordinary. The radical had become technique. This is the particular and satisfying irony of ideas that win. They win so completely that the argument disappears, and eventually only the outcome remains. There is something worth holding in this story before the detail of it falls away. What Britta Solberg brought to Clearwater County was not ingenuity. She would have been the first to say so, and she would have been right. What she brought was knowledge, specific, inherited, tested through centuries knowledge, that was entirely invisible to the people around her, not because they were incurious or unintelligent, but because they had never had any reason to encounter it. Corvin Dahl knew everything about surviving a Minnesota winter using the methods available in Clearwater County. He knew those methods completely and had refined them through 11 years of direct experience. What he did not know, what he could not have been expected to know, was that there was a different question available. His question was, how much fuel do we need to generate enough heat? Her question was, how do we build the structure so the heat is already there? These are not the same question. They do not lead to the same answers. And the gap between them, the gap that looked from the road like a woman making a serious mistake, was not a gap of intelligence or competence or even experience. It was a gap of knowledge. Nothing more and nothing less. This distinction is worth carrying forward, not as a principle in the abstract, but as a question with a name. What question are you asking? And is it the right question? The people who looked at Britta's nearly empty woodpile in October and felt concern were asking a sensible question and arriving at a correct answer by their own terms. What they could not see was that she was not playing the game they were watching. She had a different game, and it was already underway, and by January it would be won. You may know what this feels like from the inside. You may be in the middle of building something that looks, from the road, like an unnecessary diversion from the obvious urgent thing. You may have people in your life who are the equivalent of Corvin Dahl at the fence line, experienced, well-intentioned, genuinely concerned, and working from a set of questions that do not reach the thing you are actually doing. What Britta had, and what carried her through October and November and the 23rd of January at 22 below, was the particular patience of someone who knows something true and understands that the season, not the argument, will eventually do the demonstrating. She did not try to convince Corvin Dahl in October. She built the room. She moved the children in. She let February speak. Is there something in your life that you are allowing the season to prove? Something you have been told is a distraction from the obvious preparation, the sensible woodpile, the conventional arithmetic that has always kept everyone in the valley adequately warm. The people telling you this are not your enemies. They are the experts in what has worked before. They cannot see your floor. They have not pressed their palms to it and felt what you have built. The floor is warm. January will come regardless. The only question that matters in the end is whether you finished the room before the snow did. If this story landed somewhere it was supposed to, consider sharing it with someone who is building something the valley can't yet see. Every day on this channel there is another story about a person who knew something the world around them had not caught up to yet. If you have not yet made your way to the subscribe button, it is there when you are ready. This story is a work of fiction. Britta Solberg, Corvin Dahl, and all other characters depicted here are invented. The Norwegian bostad farmstead tradition, which integrated animal quarters and living spaces for thermal efficiency across centuries of Scandinavian winters, is historically documented. The story is not.